Merhaba, marhaba, salam, and hello, everyone. Thank you all for your patience. Of course, in the last 5 minutes before we started, our laptop stopped working, so we had to switch. So thank you so much for your patience. I would like first to acknowledge that we are presently located and are working on the traditional territory of the Nokochenk, Anacostan, and Piscataway, Native peoples whose lands were forcibly taken and who have yet to receive justice. I am Atiya Ahmed, an anthropologist, gender studies scholar, and part of the Institute of Middle East Studies. Along with my colleagues, Shana Marshall and Christian Clinton, we've organized today's teach-in as a space for us to learn and grapple with the events unfolding in the wake of the devastating earthquakes that took place in Türkiye and in Syria. We have with us a stellar panel of experts to help us to do so. First, online joining us is Nimet Kıraç, who is a George Washington University graduate and an independent journalist who has been covering the earthquakes from southern Türkiye from the outset. Sitting next to me is a person who perhaps needs no introduction, but I'll give her one anyways, is Alana Feldman, who is professor of anthropology, history, and international affairs at George Washington University. Also with us online is Miriam Durah, who is Associate Professor of International Affairs and the Director of the Humanitarian Action Initiative at the George Washington University. I should note here that the Humanitarian Action Initiative has kindly co-sponsored this event. Also joining us online is Kati El-Hayek, who is an Assistant Professor in the School of Professional Communication at the Creative School and a faculty member in the Yates School of Graduate Studies at the Toronto Metropolitan University. And finally, we have with us Ilana, who was just awarded a prestigious Marie Curie Fellowship and is currently a non-resident visiting fellow at CUNY in the Middle East and Middle Eastern American Center. Each of our 5 speakers will have up to 10 minutes to present, and then we'll open it up to Q&A and general discussion. Thank you all for joining us. So first, Nimet.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for organizing this event. It's very important that someone cares, the world cares, and the people in Turkey and Syria feel that the people do care about the tragedy that they are going through. I am right now in Adana in southern Turkey, which is my hometown, but I'm not in my house because of the earthquake. We are still afraid to go back into our houses. So I'm staying at a hotel and I'm working for the New York Times since the beginning of the disaster. I've been to Antakya, to Iskenderun, to Islahiye, to Kahramanmaraş, Pazarcık, a bunch of places where the earthquake impacted. The twin earthquakes actually impacted in Turkey. And the devastation is something that's very hard to explain. I've never seen anything like this. I've never been through anything as hard as this before. I believe millions of Turkish people share this sentiment with me today. There are still people under the rubble. And this is the 10th day, I believe, since the earthquake, or 9th, if I'm not mistaken. The days have mixed into each other after a while. There are still people under the rubble and the search and rescue efforts are ongoing. So this is an unfolding tragedy, a devastation to the extent that I've never seen before, not in Ukraine, not in Taliban's Afghanistan. I've never seen something as destructive as this, what we are facing today. What I would like to tell you is some of my observations from the ground. First of all, more than 35,000 people lost their lives and more than 100,000 people are injured. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of displaced people in the wintertime when it's really cold and there's a serious need for tents, diapers, hygiene products, anything that a person would need to get by with their lives. And even the people who survived the quake, They don't know what awaits them. They are in tent camps right now, or they're still out in the streets, some of them. And they are too desperate to consider themselves lucky that they are alive. And many of the people who survived lost family members, friends, people they knew, their cities, their memories, parts of their identities are gone with the devastation. And there are over 1,300 children without guardians at the moment. The Turkish government is saying they are taking care of them, but it's a very fragile environment. The quake covers 10 provinces and impacted more than 13 million people. So that's the scale of what we are up against. And it hits close to home, as I said, as Adana is one of those cities, and it's my hometown, and it's where I'm based in as a freelance journalist. I wasn't here when the earthquake happened. I was on assignment, but my family did go through the earthquake, and they've been sleeping in their restaurants since the quake because it's a 2-story building. In Adana right now, there are gymnasiums, swimming pools that are filled with people who can't go back to their houses because they are too afraid. Even if there's a crack, they don't want to experience something like that ever again. People are traumatized, they're shocked, they're very afraid. And it is such a pain to see for me, to see the cities that I love and that have so much cultural and historical heritage. For example, Antakya, known for its food, its culture, its history, its coexistence nature for centuries. It's all gone. The memories are erased. There is no more Antakya, unfortunately. In the amidst all of this devastation that's ongoing, there is conflict between the Syrian refugees in Turkey and Turks, is my observation. Turks are very upset with the earthquake and not understanding why their buildings have collapsed as they did, or why they lost the people they loved so much like they did. And they are channeling that anger to someone, and that someone today is most likely a Syrian, unfortunately. But at the same time, there are lots of looting incidents that are getting reported. So it's not entirely safe in the disaster zone across the 10 provinces today. It's like in every street you go in some of the most heavily impacted areas, it's like a bomb went off and there was a huge explosion, and even a nuclear bomb perhaps, because everything is gone in some parts of those cities. And we understand the importance of organization in terms of delivering aid, because there is lots of traffic jam, and the aid couldn't be delivered in the first 2-3 days to certain parts, and especially in the rural parts, people had to fend for themselves for about 4 or 5 days, which killed many people who died due to hypothermia. So it was a very tragic situation. It's still a very tragic situation for millions of Turkish people, as well as the Syrian refugees here. The Turkish contractors are getting arrested in the aftermath of the devastation. But at the same time, the government is under fire for the construction amnesty they allowed in 2019, which allowed for illegal constructions to become legalized upon paying some money to the government. And one problem that everyone is talking about today in Turkey is even a butcher can become a constructor. You don't need to be an engineer to become a constructor. So perhaps this was a disaster after all, but in the end, the question becomes, was it also a massacre? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nimet. Next, we have Alana Feldman.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for letting me join with you. So Atiya, I am not a specialist on Turkey or Syria, but Atiya has asked me to participate in this and speak to you about thinking kind of about the humanitarian circumstances from my perspective of having done research on Palestine and the Palestinian experience with humanitarianism for over the long term. Basically, I want to think about some of the things that we may see as time goes forward, and things to be sort of looking out for, concerned about, paying attention to as this circumstance unfolds, as it will certainly unfold over time. And every circumstance is distinct. There is no generic humanitarian response or generic humanitarian catastrophe, but there are many phenomena that we see sort of echoing from one circumstance to another. So in looking at the Palestinian situation and entanglement with humanitarian practices and institutions over 7 decades, I have thought about humanitarian response as unfolding kind of in 2 nested kind of temporal frameworks. One is the humanitarian situation, which is, I think, what we are in now in Turkey and Syria, the emergency that presents itself as pressing and which mobilizes a humanitarian emergency. One of the things that we've already heard from Nimet, and I'm sure there are other speakers who will report about circumstances on the ground. I already hear lots of echoes from things that I am familiar with from the Palestinian instance, which is one that even as a crisis mobilizes a machinery, at the beginning, in the outset, there's a tremendous amount of chaos and challenge in actually delivering aid. In the most kind of acute moment, aid can be hard to get to people. But then as sort of time unfolds, we move into what I describe as the humanitarian condition, which is the less acute, but no less fundamental experience of living in circumstances of longer term need, longer term displacement. And again, we don't know, we can't project forward for what the duration of such a humanitarian condition might be in this instance, but I think we have to assume that this is going to be a long-term process that will not resolve itself immediately or quickly. And certainly in the Palestinian case, there is not a linear move from one framework to another, right? You don't start with a situation, a crisis, and move into the chronic and be done, but rather crises reoccur and repeat, and they overlay and punctuate ongoing deprivation and precarity. And so that is another thing I think that we want to be attentive to as time goes on, as you move from the immediate efforts to sort of save and recover to the circumstances of people trying to live in this aftermath. And I think Nimet's pointing to the already tension and conflict or anger directed at Syrians. That's the kind of thing that you might see emerging as crises over time, where you have populations that are share an experience of deprivation, but not the same relationship to the space or to the agencies and governments that are working. And we also certainly know that in these spaces, in the places where this event has happened, this dramatic crisis overlays years of other forms of displacement and crisis, all of which find their way into the experience of the present moment. And the move between stasis and crisis, between chronic need and emergency conditions is, that's part of an extended humanitarian time, produces a lot of challenges for humanitarian actors. It obviously produces tremendous challenges for the people who are living in these circumstances. But when we think about how it is that humanitarians respond to these things, I just wanted to say a little bit about some of the kind of frameworks for those challenges. One of which I think is precisely humanitarian temporalities, that the present, the now, is humanitarianism's kind of natural time, the framework within which it is most comfortable, with its definition as crisis response and a goal of saving lives and moving on. Humanitarian practice generally focuses on needs that are both urgent now and can be addressed now, rather than on planning for futures. But almost always humanitarians are forced to grapple with longer time frames. But even though these kinds of situations of long-term humanitarian need are common, they really strain the limits of the humanitarian imaginary and also of humanitarian resources. So in the Palestinian case, for instance, I've considered the challenge that humanitarian providers have in meeting the healthcare needs of the elderly or people who are dying from old age rather than from an immediate humanitarian cause. So again, while we don't know how long this circumstance will be one that is kind of operating through a humanitarian framework, but we can expect that it will be extended to somewhat. The kind of future problems that emerge for humanitarians to grapple with, and with which they may be able to do so only very partially, is something that I think that we will encounter, and that's again something to be sort of pushing for, thinking about what is a necessary response. It has to incorporate the multiple kinds of needs that people have. There's also a challenge that emerges over time in the question of humanitarian purpose, because again, if your goal is to kind of save lives or relieve suffering in the more murky and increasingly complicated, as time goes on, the causes of people's suffering become less easy to pinpoint as having a singular origin that can be met with a singular kind of response. And humanitarians face a real challenge in trying to really figure out what is it that we can do if our imperative is to do good. And that's a complicated standpoint, but if that's the imperative to relieve suffering, how do we do so when the causes of suffering become increasingly diffuse and complex over time? And then just to say one or two more things about forgetting in humanitarian instances, because I think we are all familiar with the very short attention spans of global publics and donors, and with the, even from the very outset, and very unequal attention that circumstances can get in terms of capturing a humanitarian public. And so I just want to note a couple of things that I think can contribute to such forgetting and to such different attention. That we should be attentive to as we respond and think about what's going on. One is that the category of humanity, which is the ground for international humanitarian compassion and response, is a fractured category in which only some people some of the time can really qualify for entry. So even though there is a humanitarian principle that all lives should have equal value and that everyone's suffering deserves to be relieved, in fact, this principle is almost impossible to make fact. And we see that over and over again. So as conversations develop over time, as I am sure they will, I haven't seen as much of it as we have seen in some other instances, but even there are already echoes, and there will be more about, how to allocate resource, what's possible to do, and where you should be suspicious of the people that might be receiving resources. As those conversations emerge, I think we should just remember that they emerge not just from the circumstances, but from prior expectations about who the people are that are suffering. And connected to that, I think we also should always remember that victims of whatever circumstance of this earthquake, of prior displacements, of war, are full, complex, and contradictory subjects, and they have the right to be such, even when they are suffering dramatically. There is a kind of tendency, a powerful through line in humanitarian language and in the calls for humanitarian response to see people in their victimhood, because that is the most human thing that we can see of them. And while one can understand the power in that, there is also a danger in that, because when people appear as something other than, in addition to, more complicated than being pure victims, they can sometimes seem to be less worthy of our compassion and response. And so that's, again, another thing I think we want to be attentive to when people are being denied concern or care because they are as full and complicated as we all are. Stop there.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Feldman. Next, we have Miriam Durah, who's joining us via Zoom.
Good afternoon. Thank you to Atia and to Christian for organizing this event. My name is Miriam Durah. I'm a political scientist, associate professor at the Elliott School, and also the director of the Humanitarian Action Initiative. I just threw up some of our information there in the chat. And because I'm a political scientist, I thought I would talk about this crisis through the lens of geopolitics, the geopolitics of aid, the global context for humanitarian assistance, including access constraints and the limits of humanitarian law. And I think it's important, I have some slides, I just have 2 slides. I think it's important to visualize what is happening here. So when I woke up to the news of the earthquake, before reading anything about the magnitude of the earthquake or the initial number of lives lost, I was devastated because I knew how horrific the outcome would be because of where the earthquake was located. And just to give you a context of why I say this, if you look at this map on the right here, this gives you a sense of the humanitarian conditions. This is from January. This is from the UN. This is from January situation report. And if you look at this prior to the earthquake, oh, did we lose the screen? Sorry about that. Sorry. Sorry, don't know what happened there. Prior to the earthquake, the situation in northwest Syria was already rapidly deteriorating. As many of you know, there's been a decade-long conflict in Syria. There was increasing food insecurity, collapsing healthcare systems, lack of access to safe water and poor sanitation, which together had combined to produce a cholera outbreak in Syria. There were already 4.1 million people in need. And if you look at this map, you can see that 1/3 of those were located in northern Aleppo and about 2/3 in the Idlib area. A majority of those people living in these 2 areas in the Northwest region were internally displaced from other parts of Syria. And there are estimates that 80% of those displaced have been displaced 6 to 25 times. In Idlib, about 2 million people were living in camps. In northern Aleppo, that was about 500,000 people. And 80% of those living in camps and informal structures were women and children. As with most humanitarian responses prior to the earthquake, the Syrian humanitarian response plans, which are issued by the United Nations, were chronically underfunded. In 2022, it was funded at 47%, which is the lowest in 6 years. So when you look at this map on the left, you can see that this is precisely the area where the earthquake struck. So you can see here, you have the in sort of this area here, you have the northern Aleppo and Idlib areas that are rebel held, and the earthquake strikes precisely in this area. So on the one hand, there was already humanitarian presence, both local and international humanitarian groups. The earthquake, however, crippled this critical infrastructure, warehouses and coordination mechanisms that were in place, and the supply chains necessary to organize delivery of aid into Syria. The logistical backbone of the UN operations was located in Gaziantep. And when I heard that they were struck, I was just devastated because I knew that that's where a lot of the resources and the coordination mechanisms were already located, and actually a lot of the refugee services inside Turkey. So Gaziantep was at the very center of the earthquake and has been severely damaged. The local stockpiles that had been stored, pre-positioned in northern Syria have either been damaged or whittled down. And unlike in Syria and other parts of Turkey, there is no government presence in this northwest Syria area. Service delivery relies heavily on humanitarian actors, primarily local actors and diaspora groups, because there is no functioning government. The white helmets are a huge presence, and I'm sure you've seen them on the news if you've been following this. According to Raid al-Saleh, who is head of the White Helmets, they are the only organization right now with the search and rescue capabilities to undertake the search and rescue operations, and only 5% of the damaged sites in Northwest Syria have been covered by search and rescue operations. So while there is an enormous operation underway in affected areas in Turkey, there is diminished humanitarian access and aid obstruction in Northwest Syria, which will complicate relief efforts and result in unnecessary loss of life. And if you've been paying attention, there's been a lot of discussion on whether the international system has failed and whether the UN has failed. Martin Griffiths, the UN Undersecretary for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, visited the region, which was actually symbolically very important and very important that he showed up in this area. But he said, "We have so far failed the people in Northwest Syria. They rightly feel abandoned, looking for international help that hasn't arrived. My duty and our obligation is to correct this failure as fast as we can. That's my focus now." And, you know, we can blame the UN, but I wanted to put this in a broader perspective of international assistance and international law. So aid access to this area in Northwest Syria has long been impeded and used as a political weapon by the Syrian regime and its allies. And this dynamic is now threatening millions of lives, adding to the destruction of the earthquake. When we say humanitarian access, there's actually a specific legal and political meaning. It is the ability of humanitarian aid to reach the most vulnerable and the most vulnerable to reach humanitarian aid. This encompasses access to basic necessities of life, regardless of source. The definition of humanitarian access was first defined by a UN General Assembly resolution in 1991, and it underlines the importance of safe and unimpeded access for humanitarian personnel and for those in need of assistance. The legal foundations establishing the right to basic humanitarian assistance, and by extension, the rights and duties regarding delivery of assistance and facilitation of access, are found within international humanitarian law. The core principles of international humanitarian law affirm that the duty for responding to the needs of civilians in situations of armed conflict rests first and foremost with parties to the conflicts themselves. However, IHL provides that if parties to a conflict cannot meet the needs of the affected populations or will not meet the needs of the affected populations, humanitarian organizations can offer their services. While consent of the affected state is required, it cannot be arbitrarily withheld. And this is a really important sentence that we'll return to in a couple minutes. So, of course, negotiation of access is a political process, particularly in conflict settings. Belligerents have every interest in impeding access to enemy-held territories. After the Syrian revolution broke out in 2011, the Assad regime systematically denied humanitarian assistance to areas under opposition control. In Syria, the northwest area is controlled by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, which is a coalition of armed groups formerly affiliated with al-Qaeda, as well as some Turkish-backed groups. So if we I would go back to the map, but that was sort of a tricky thing. So if we go back to this map, you can see there's these border crossings here, but most of them have been closed. There's just one border crossing right now into this northwest area that's held by HTS. That was damaged severely in the earthquake. And basically the areas that were struck in Syria overlap almost perfectly with the opposition held areas in the country. So in response, the Security Council of the United Nations has adopted Resolution 2165 in 2014. This resolution allowed UN agencies as well as other international organizations to fund, deliver, and coordinate aid through 4 border crossings. And as I just showed you on the map, that those border crossings have been reduced to just the one, Bab al-Hawa, which was damaged in the earthquake. In 2023, the UN Security Council renewed a resolution that allowed for humanitarian aid to be delivered to millions of Syrians without the permission of the Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad. And in the weeks leading up to the vote, many humanitarian workers, states, diplomats were very worried that Russia would use its veto power at the Security Council to block the cross-border aid. This, of course, is because, and I'll just remind you because we're at a teach-in and I'm a professor, this, of course, is because the UN Security Council, 5 permanent members, the US, UK, China, Russia, and France, have veto power. Russia is one of Assad's closest backers and has long argued that humanitarian missions violate Syria's sovereignty. It has previously vetoed the use of other crossing points for aid delivery into Syria. And beyond Syria, this dynamic of the politicization of aid has played out in numerous current conflict settings. In recent years, China and Russia have used or threatened to use their veto power at the Security Council to enable governments to deprive their own people of humanitarian assistance. Russia and China this summer blocked resolutions decrying humanitarian crises in Myanmar and in Ethiopia. To justify limiting or blocking aid, China and Russia argue that sovereignty is inviolable, even when oppressive regimes are conducting or impeding humanitarian aid from reaching their own people. This is one very strict reading of international law. However, as previously noted, international humanitarian law provides that while consent of the affected state is required, it cannot be arbitrarily withheld. So some argue, and I would argue as well, that Syrian government's withholding of consent to humanitarian assistance in these non-government controlled parts of northwest Syria is arbitrary. This means that, among other things, the Syrian government has blocked aid in a manner that violates its obligations to international humanitarian law and its responsibility to protect. Some legal scholars also argue that sovereignty doesn't really apply in this area because the Syrian regime does not hold, it actually doesn't have any control over this northwest area. And therefore, cross-border aid is not illegal according to humanitarian law. So just to, again, give it more context, politicizing and weaponizing humanitarian aid is, of course, not new. This is not just happening for the first time. We can go all the way back to the Biafra crisis in modern humanitarian history in the late 1960s, where secessionists and the Nigerian government both politicized aid for their own purposes. In the 1980s, amidst the Cold War, the Ethiopia, USSR, and the US politicized the famine, the recurrent famines in Ethiopia. In 2008, the military junta in Myanmar prevented international aid workers from entering the country after Cyclone Nargis hit, and they continue to impede access to areas held by ethnic minorities. So this isn't necessarily new, but it's adding to the human suffering, particularly right now in northwest Syria, less so in Turkey. There are different conditions. So even with the new UN resolution that did allow cross-border access, humanitarian assistance has effectively been throttled. This is because there's multiple tools for denying access, including insecurity, bureaucratic impediments, and legal and policy instruments. So just the mere threat of a potential Russian veto stymied the humanitarian response because it created uncertainty for humanitarian organizations on whether they can plan for a longer term presence in the region, right? They have to decide, are we going to start up operations or invest in operations if we're going to be shut down? The new 2023 UN resolution now needs to be negotiated every 6 months. Previously, it had been every 12 months. So now that window has been shortened even more. And finally, and I've just seen your note, Atia, sorry. And it is my final point. The US government in 2018 designated the HTS as a foreign terrorist organization. And so this adds a layer of legal and policy dimensions and complications because humanitarian organizations and actually a lot of financial institutions like banks become very reticent that they might They might violate sanctions. They fear legal and financial risks, and so they're less likely to provide services in areas where there's a potential of violating sanctions. So I just wanted to provide some of this geopolitical context for you that I think makes this particular humanitarian response even more complex than just the operational and logistical components, and happy to answer any questions in the Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Next, we have Kati Al-Hayek, who'll be joining us via Zoom.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for organizing this teach-in. Actually, I'm still not in a state of mind to rationalize that much what's happening. So I'm actually in more conversational style. I'm gonna share with you my observation. So I am currently assistant professor in communication in Toronto, Canada, but I have lived in the United States since 2012. And if some of you students, because now I talk with my students about Syrian uprising or Arab Spring, and they were 6 or 7 years old when this stuff happened. So they think of it like ages of the dinosaur and don't know anything about it. So in 2010, and briefly, I'm gonna give you some context and connect it to my life because I lived through that. So in 2010, the Arab Spring social movement happened where a lot of young people participated. In Syria, Syria joined in March 2011. And the movement started with a lot of young people and peaceful protests, but especially in 2012, the following year, things, because the Syrian regime response was violence, then things got complicated, and by the support of several regional and international powers, really Syria entered long-term conflict that transferred from local to international. But from 2015, there was a lot of solidarity with Syrian refugees because, so to understand the Syrian refugee population and who stayed in neighboring country like Turkey, which was affected by the earthquake, we have to understand that actually more than half of Syria population were displaced. A lot of people, the majority stayed either inside Syria as internally displaced or in neighboring country in Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon. Turkey had over 3 million Syrian refugees. Lebanon had over 1 million, and Jordan had over 600,000, and Iraq and the Kurdistan region had over 200,000 Syrian. But people in the West, in the US, Canada, and European got interested in Syrian refugee crisis in 2015 because of an iconic now image of a 3-year-old Syrian child whose family were actually trying to cross the Mediterranean from Turkey to Europe, and the child was drawn, and huge solidarity movement. It was international. People from Europe went to Turkey. There was human carnivals of people opening borders and feeling solidarity and welcoming Syrian refugees in Western European states. Still, the numbers are very small in comparison with people who stayed in neighboring countries of Syria. And if you remember, and as a Syrian person, I lived through that in the United States with the rise of Trump in 2015 and 16. Actually, in particularly, the United States had negative relation with Syrian refugees in comparison with other countries. There was a travel ban. There was targeting of Syrian refugees, denying of asylum. And like Canada, where I live now, had more positive relation with refugees, because the story I told you about Alana Kurdi, who his family was actually trying to relocate to Canada, but they did not process their application on time, so there was a lot of guilt. But still, Canada only hosted 70,000 Syrian refugees, and the United States only like around 8,000. So the number is very low. But who comes to this like wealthy country from the Syrian refugee population? People who like have privilege of education, or who are from middle class background. Some people who are businessmen, like more upper class, like invested their money and stayed in Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon. But the majority of people are really from low socioeconomic class, who weren't able, because even if you want to go to Europe, you have like to give a smuggler a lot of money. So this is the population, like already the most marginalized Syrian refugee population stayed, especially in the Northwest, because even if you like, if you want to understand more the context of the conflict in Syria, Syrian regime, like all the opposition group, when he was winning the conflict, especially in 2016, 2017, and 18, he put in buses actually the former fighters, opposition fighters, their families from like around Damascus, and swap demography with people from Idlib and Northwest Syria. So he sent all kind of like the like remaining of the armed opposition and the most marginalized victims of the war to Northwest. So that's like more context about the refugee population. Also, this population that now affected by the earthquake are lived through severe economic collapse and food insecurity for the last few years. For the last few years, over 2 million Syrians experienced extreme food insecurity. So before this crisis, you can imagine how the situation is bad now. To like give you example from my personal life, when I left Syria, $1 equaled 50 Syrian pound. Now $1 equal over 6,000 Syrian pounds. So you can like imagine, even people like who have money, like when you buy stuff, things are low quality. Like this political situation, this economic collapse, also like economic collapse in Syria was affected by what happened in Lebanon. If you followed in 2020, there was Beirut explosion that also like made over 300,000 Lebanese homeless, and Syrian refugees there also were affected and were experiencing a lot of like racism and hostility on top of everything. And before 2020, like Syria will depend on Lebanon to like escape some of the economic sanctions from the West, especially from the United States and its allies. But after that, things really, like I know from my family, things really like got bad. So I try to like, when I'm in such situation and when I'm dealing with students or colleagues who like not familiar maybe that much with the context, to like maintain critical hope. But really like Syria since 2011 until now experienced like a crisis on top of a crisis on top of a crisis, which make like the current situation really like dark and complex. And if you're now like to conclude in the United States and Biden is still a president, so there are like margin of activism and like motivating US government to do like some good intervention. I'm not hopeful about the future of the US after 2024 or in general, but like I think this is the time to like do good activism if you're passionate about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Next, we have Dilan Oktualu, who'll be joining us via Zoom.
Thank you, Atia. I would also like to start with thanking the organizers. Like Kathy, it is very challenging to talk about this deadly crisis at the moment. It affected me on a personal level, but also collective level. So I would like to use this platform to also ask people to donate for people who are severely affected by the earthquake. So that's actually the main motivation for me, and I hope to be part of different fundraising activities in the medium and long run, actually. So let me start with sharing my screen, because I have slides, because it's going to keep me focused when I'm talking. Otherwise, I may be extremely emotional, and I don't want to go into that at the moment. So let's start. Okay. Okay. Earthquake actually so impacted a large region, which is somehow equal to the size of Ohio in the US, and also approximately the size of Germany. At the moment, currently, as of today, more than 13 million people are affected by this crisis. And it is the deadliest one, the worst one in the history of the Republic, let's say approximately in the last century. And for those of us who saw war zones, probably the pictures would resemble to an actual real war zone. So we know it. We slept next to rubbles, right? So it's quite real. That's why we need a kind of honest conversation instead of coming up with fake and fictitious categories, like Turkish society, for instance, is one of them. Because this is not a unified society at all. And the ongoing hierarchies, ethnic hierarchies in Turkey between majority and other ethnic and religious minority groups will, of course, affect the way people relate to this incident and the extent to which they can have access to facilities and resources. So, and also the number of people like Syrians who died in the Kurdish populated region of Turkey, close to borders, is more than 6,000. So that is also very devastating. So in this today's short teaching session, I would like to first start with the explanatory factors, right? Why is it important to understand and explain this deadly crisis, this earthquake? Because of course it's important to take necessary measures for future earthquakes, but also for people who are already affected by the current one. The second component of today's talk is about organizing aid. So what are the challenges to organize aid so as to help people in the long run? What kind of ethics or ethical like principle we should adopt? And also the last point that I will briefly talk about is the path ahead. Like, what are the things that we should do? How can we deal with that as an outsider or as people who are observing disaster. Because now I know I'm talking to Western audience. That's why I believe that watching those kind of disasters also bears some sort of responsibility. So witnessing has this kind of impact, I guess, that it's hard to detach yourself. And some of the points are quite relevant to what Ilana said at the beginning. And I think she set up a very useful framework for those of us who want to think about the ethics of aid, right? So explanatory factors are, of course, there are local, but also national and global factors explaining why this earthquake has become that deadly, right? Why are there more than like 100,000 people? Why are there so many people who are still missing? And people couldn't even find the bodies. Because we know that in Japan, that's not the case. We had different examples from all over the world. That's why it is a man-made earthquake. And there are local factors explaining the situation. One of them is the long history of underdevelopment or economic control of the region, right? In certain cases, this refers to neglecting the needs of people. In some other cases, it includes not being responsive enough. In some other cases, it includes corruption. And of course, the ongoing economic crisis in Turkey, high inflation rate, high unemployment rate, so on and so forth. Or misuse of resources, right? It again goes back to corruption maybe, but in a different way, I think. Because coup happened in 2016, and such kind of things also has costs, even both financial and political cost, actually. And of course, long history of war and conflict, right? 40 years of protracted conflict between the Turkish state and Kurdistan's Workers' Party, and the rise of ISIS, right? And because that area, the borders were quite open, and we are talking about porous borders for some time. That's why Turkey was also accused for supporting different non-state actors, the terrorists. So this also, of course, goes back to what Katy said about, and also what Miriam said about Northwest Syria and how marginalized the region is, because help is, they couldn't get help on time because borders were not open, because this already like conflict zones, war zones, and this situation in Syria has already turned into political game, and every actor has their own legacy. So when we are talking about humanitarian aid, we're still talking about politics. We're still talking about the situation that couldn't transcend the interests of actors involved, political actors. So how civilian is that? So how far can we talk about this? If so, how is it possible to find a compromise between the political interest of those actors involved and between the interest of civilians? And the final point is, again, goes back to, I think, economic problems and crisis in Turkey, and also, of course, ongoing academic deadlock and everything, or crackdown, bad governance, right? The state couldn't respond on time, and there are remote towns and villages, for instance, in Kahramanmaraş, in Elbistan, Pazarcık, which is mostly Kurdish Alevi dominated areas. They are both ethnically and religiously marginalized. And in Adıyaman, it's another city. In Hatay, Antakya, these are the Arab Alevis, Christians. There's a long history of Judaism there. When you watch different videos and listen to this podcast, or try to update yourself as much as your mental health allows to do that, you see that everyone says the same thing. Where's the state? We didn't see anyone, especially in the first 48 hours, even maybe longer, especially in those towns and villages, because we're talking about winter. This is a mountainous area, and sometimes there's no access between the center of the town and surrounding towns that are scattered. Especially those who know the region know what I'm talking about. I traveled that area, I lived there. So, and because of that bad governance, we don't see any accountability. Only Erdogan said in one of the press conferences, he said that I accept that there are some problems in reaching out people and helping them. That's the only thing that he said. But nobody, for instance, resigned in Turkey yet. And also on February 7, the government announced state of emergency in 10 earthquake provinces. And it's likely that the state of emergency will be extended after May 7. And Turkey was expected to have elections on the 14th of May, which is likely not going to happen. And that's why, for some people, the current situation after this deadly crisis, which is going to take years to recover, quote unquote, if there is any recovery, that will have a deadly impact on Turkey's political arena as well, which means that Turkey is turning into an unknown political territory. We can come back to that during the Q&A. Okay, and other reasons like shoddy construction, the role of contractors, we can come back to that as well, because they are important, of course, but we know that none of the contractors would be able to build those buildings without permission from political actors and bureaucracy. So who are the enablers? We have to talk about that. So how can you organize humanitarian action in Turkey, in a country like Turkey? So there are certain challenges. I think Nimet mentioned some of them very well, because she's offering firsthand experiences and observations from the region. I have only few things to add on that, because I don't want to take your time. I'm the last speaker. All of us are tired, I know. But please be patient, be with me for a couple more minutes, okay? There are racist and nationalist thugs targeting international rescue teams. For instance, a team from Israel, they had to, because they built a hospital close to, I think, Adana. Maybe I'm wrong. Nimet, you can correct me. Maybe in Maraş, one of them. But they had to leave the country because there was a security threat. So intelligence agents and the state security forces could not maintain safety of these international rescue teams on the ground. So some of them are leaving. And a group from Germany, another group from Spain, they're all going back to their countries. Even if they know that Turkey does not have sufficient resources to handle the situation, to cope with the crisis. So we're talking about a weak state or failed state in terms of service provision and fair distribution of resources. And especially in the last few days, people's frustration and the sense of helplessness is turning into anger, okay? And especially it's growing in destroyed towns. And it is important for those rescue teams, both national and international rescue teams, to navigate around control mechanisms. And some of these control mechanisms, of course, come from states, because we saw some videos where police officers were beating up people, and in some cases, they justified it because they thought that these people were stealing those products. Yes.
Dilan, sorry, this is Atia. These are really important issues that you're bringing up. But I'm mindful of time and we've gone over 10 minutes. And I want to make sure that our students and our audience who are both here in person, but also online, have an opportunity to ask questions and for us to explore these questions. I'm afraid we've gone past the 10-minute mark.
Okay, can you give me 2 more minutes? Then I'm gonna stop.
If you can wrap up in just 1 minute,
Yes,
because
sure.
we really
Sure,
do
sure.
want to have time for questions. Thank you.
Okay, that's fine. So yeah, and in order to deal with those challenges, we have to adopt, again, humanitarian ethics, ethical principles, and it has to be practice oriented. We have to take responsibility as a core principle and empathy. And we shouldn't we have to talk with bureaucrats and NGO activists and make sure that new construction sites will not be built soon. And this is the last slide. You can read it yourself, but there are things that we can do at the moment. There are some other things that we can do in the long run, and putting pressure on the government to allocate more resources for risk mitigation is one of them, so that there can be an effective and real action plan. And also new government agency for risk assessment and policy suggestions can also be, in place, and we can be part of different fundraising activities. Thank you.
I wish I had the opportunity to expand time to allow us all, the opportunity to speak more. Thank you so much. So again, in the spirit of keeping this as a teach-in, I wanted to just turn it over to our audience, both in person and online, if folks have questions that they want to pose. So we have a member here in the audience.
I'm Seda Kunes. I'm from Turkey and I'm a graduate student, SPS. And also I really appreciate because you organized this discussion. I lost my friends during this earthquake and I'm really happy to learn more about this. And I have a question to Dr. Miriam. You said that one of the arguments is that the Syrian government does not control this earthquake region. So it is unlikely to see violation of Security Council resolution. However, turns out from the claims of Assad regime, they believe that they have authority in that region and stated that they will keep the border open during the 3 weeks for the humanitarian aid. Do you think that after 3 weeks, if the humanitarian aid organization do not leave the region, the Assad forces attack? Can the Assad forces attack the region to prove its authority? And also, can the argument put people in the region under more risk?
Atiya, would you like me to answer that, or are you going to collect questions?
Why don't you go ahead and answer that, and then we'll.
Yeah, it's very complicated. So of course, the opinion that I was stating was from the legal community that's saying, sovereignty doesn't necessarily apply here. There isn't, the definition of sovereignty, right, is control of the rule of force, and that the Syrian government is not controlling the northwest areas. Of course, the Syrian government itself is going to say this is part of Syria and this is part of our territory. So there's that contestation. The really sad part of the politicization of aid is that it goes both ways. So, for example, Assad, backed by the Russians, have been insisting upon aid going through Damascus so that they could control the distribution of aid. Humanitarian workers and organizations generally oppose that kind of centralized distribution because it often means that they will be distributing to those that agree with the regime and overlooking opponents, right? And so that you won't get impartial assistance, which is, in theory, one of the core principles of humanitarian action, is that everyone gets access to aid. The other part of this is that we are in an active conflict zone. So HTS, through a spokesperson, recently told Reuters that they would not allow convoys coming in from Damascus or coming in from the federal government because they did not want the federal government to be using this, or the Assad government to be using this as an opportunity to say that they cared about the people. And so the politicization of aid works on both sides, right? It works on all sides, where organizations kind of use this to their interest. To go back to something, I can't remember who said it, but the attack on aid workers is a real problem in any conflict zone or even non-conflict zone. So the fact that international workers are being targeted is not, unfortunately, is not a rare occurrence. This happens because organizations have a duty of care to their staff. And so if violence occurs, like we saw this in Afghanistan, a lot of times organizations will withdraw their staff. And this results obviously in people that need assistance not getting assistance. It's also important to note that local organizations are present and very important in this this response, and even prior to the earthquake. However, local organizations are composed of local people, and they're often at more security risk because they have affiliations, they have family members living there, and so it makes it extremely difficult for them to provide assistance as well.
A comment online from a GW student who's currently in Turkey who asked.
We have a bunch of online questions.
Oh, online questions. Okay.
Yes, we can turn that. We also have questions from.
Okay,
our audience.
so we'll pause on that and
Heather,
just.
no, Heather can go ahead. I unmuted her.
Okay.
Go ahead,
Thank you.
Heather.
I'm a graduate from the Elliott School and I am based in Izmir, Turkey. I work for a Turkish international NGO called International Blue Crescent. We have been responding to the earthquake from the first hours as we have offices established in the earthquake region where we do the bulk of our Syrian refugee response work. Currently, we are operating in Northwest Syria. We are giving bread, food, hygiene kits, and we are able to distribute medicine from our mobile clinics. We are participating in the OCHA working group, which is helping to coordinate response there, as well as make a standardized assessment mechanism and reporting tool for all of the local NGOs and international NGOs to use. That has been really helpful to have the support of such a strong coordination mechanism helping us. And bringing goods into Turkey has been a challenge for local NGOs anyway, as the import laws have changed under the declared state of emergency. So that's currently an issue that we are working to solve. And I know the panelists have mentioned financial contributions are really important during this time because it can help us deliver aid immediately to the places that need it the most. And another thing I wanted to note is that currently the earthquake region is being evacuated. So I think the current number is about 165,000 people have been formally evacuated by AFAD, and about 2 million have evacuated on their own. Turkish citizens are eligible to be evacuated under the care of AFAD, where they will be provided food and shelter when they arrive at their assigned city. However, this is not the case for refugees and people who are here as well. And so the aid will need to be distributed to new regions of Turkey as people resettle. So these are the things that we are seeing now. And the needs of the people will be changing rapidly as the situation changes and their locations change as well.
So much, Heather, for your comment, and a reminder again that this is a hybrid event involving folks who are both intensely local at GW, but also far-flung around the world. So thank you so much for that. Now we're going to collect a number of questions that were submitted online.
Okay, so the first question comes from Shanaz, who works with the Syrian American Medical Society. They say, very thoughtful presentation. We are working inside northwest Syria to treat patients who provide humanitarian relief, despite our hospitals in Aleppo and Idlib being severely damaged, along with our medical equipment. As we move into the next phase post-earthquake, SAMS is trying to fill a gap in a broken healthcare system that is even more broken now. Earthquakes have happened before in other countries like Haiti, Indonesia, and Japan. What are some good examples of successful humanitarian initiatives in countries that have experienced earthquakes before in regards to healthcare, shelter, etc., and were able to recover quicker? Should we read additional questions or just stop this one?
Let's read some more, just in the interest of time.
I'll read a couple others. There are conflicting reports of early warning signs that this earthquake was going to happen. Can anyone confirm?
And then I see.
And then Shayna has some as well.
Yeah, I have a few questions. This is from Naz, who's one of our PhD students at GW. She says, I'm curious if any of the presenters have any empirical knowledge on how humanitarian help for Syrians is being organized inside Turkey since the earthquake. In particular, I have not understood if the relocation incentives that are offered for the hotels and student dorms in other cities are available for the Syrian migrants who have been living in Turkey as guests without legal official permission to relocate. So that's one question. And then also she asks if the panelists have suggestions on how to build a more constructive narrative about, I guess, communitarianism and sort of help, within Turkey for Syrians, to emphasize the need for international humanitarian aid in Idlib and Turkey, controlled parts of Aleppo, right? Because that humanitarian assistance would need to pass through Turkey by air or by land. She says, thus far, due to anti-Syrian sentiment in Turkey, this point has been extremely politicized. And emphasizing that issue could very well cause a political backlash. So she's asking if there's a way to sort of change the way that's perceived.
Okay. So those were a wide-ranging number of questions, especially just to ensure that folks who are online have a chance also to weigh in. Would anyone like to respond immediately to that panoply of questions? In terms of other experiences with disasters, in particular earthquakes in other regions, if their comparative dimension of that can provide us with some insights, thinking also about the circumstances of Syrian refugees in Turkey, if someone wants to elaborate more on the particularities of their circumstances.
I can comment on one part of it. I think the question was seeking to find an answer to whether the Syrian refugees are eligible to use the tents and the other means of aid in Turkey right now. Based on my observations, the Syrians are able to live in the tents that AFAD distributes. However, in one tent camp that I've been to in Islahiye in Gaziantep, a Turkish family I spoke to said that they were living side by side in the tents with Syrians, but then there was social conflict, and in the end, the Turks told the police that the Syrians should go away. So they moved the tents of the Syrians a little bit further elsewhere in a way. So the Syrians are able to stay in the Afad tents, is as far as I know. However, there's the social conflict, the undercurrent that's going on.
Hi. So I'm gonna share just short advice from my experience. I'm more in media studies and gender studies. So what happens generally, at the beginning of natural disasters or war or anything, there is a lot of compassion and solidarity globally. But then people start to experience compassion fatigue, and that's happened already with Syrian. That's what I was telling you, in 2015, a lot of solidarity, then not that much later. So the thing is, and for my experience as Syrian, with the Syrian experience, there are a lot of like activist organizations that prove themselves, and they're starting to like think about long term, because now there are coming aid like for basic need, right? But people who lost their home, and some people lost their home now like for the 6th or 7th time. So there are some organizations who are trying to think more long term and how we can build like homes for this like marginalized member of the community. Like now there is campaign, and I think already like the link was maybe in the event registration link, like Mulham volunteering team now have a campaign called We Can Fund to build houses for like around 4,000 Syrian family from like the most marginalized community member who were affected by earthquake. So I think if you're like passionate and about this issue, like remember that other people who are not like passionate like you will experience soon compassion fatigue. So like keep an eye on like continue activism around this issue, and maybe promote like trusted organizations who proved themselves and who are also in the coming months and year trying to like rebuild houses and helping in long-term solutions. And actually, I want to add something, because now, like this compassion fatigue relate to an idea. You will see in the news a lot of like articles that, oh, corruption happened, people like scammed donation. And I was like reading an article last week, so like also like a way to respond. Part of like humanizing a group is that, of course, no group, no community, all the people are good people. Of course, power relation exists and like corruption exists around the world. So be prepared to respond like that. But I was like reading the article, and people who were like victim of a scam were donating to individuals who are not trusted, who just like will have a TikTok campaign or a Facebook campaign. So if like you were presented with such cases, like just like make people like please be aware. If you're passionate, like don't maybe donate now to individual, donate to an organization who like have capacity and have awareness and connection to like bring this assistance to the people who need it.
Thank you so much, Katty. I just also want to make sure I give an opportunity for folks who are here present with us. If anyone has a question.
Can I maybe, while people are contemplating, just say something again without a lot of on the ground knowledge, but just looking at kind of similarities, the kinds of tensions that people have mentioned between Syrians and Turkish populations about aid. I mean, this is something that you see regularly, and certainly was part of the Palestinian instance and others as well, that aid groups come in, whether it's UN, and especially things that are coming in under the auspices of the international community and the United Nations, which has criteria to determine where things go, how it's delivered, and who is eligible, that those kinds of criteria work to differentiate among people who all have needs. Those needs may not be identical. The circumstances which have led to what they're facing may not be the same, but everybody has need. And when aid is differentially delivered, then that contributes to the kinds of tensions that emerge among populations that are living in crisis together. And here you have a circumstance where this, as Katty was saying, has already happened, right? You've already had a buildup of tension and frustration about an ongoing, the kind of weight of somebody else's suffering in your daily life, and now everybody is suffering. And I don't know, there's not a clear answer to this, but this is going to sound incredibly naive. One of the problems with responding adequately to the circumstance is that it has to be responded to differently because of borders and because of political circumstances and because of categories of persons. And that necessity means that the response will create problems. And it's hard to see, it's not very optimistic, but it's hard to see a way out of that, as long as those differences guide the flow of relief, but also the kind of relief.
We just did get a comment that speaks directly to that, which is that a recent UNHCR briefing made it clear that Syrians will only be provided earthquake relief if they remain in that earthquake region, right? But if they move outside that region where they've been registered, they will not receive assistance once they leave that area. Only Turkish citizens are receiving aid upon evacuation. So that, again, creates another real gap between those populations.
And we have another online question as well.
Okay, let's go to
This question is for you, Professor Feldman, on possible strategies of organizing as volunteers when public institutions fail people. What can we learn from the Palestinian experience?
Oh, well, that is a good question. Actually, I mean, I think that in some sense we need to work against an ultimate separation between the idea of sort of public volunteers and institutional response or government response, because while it's very important for people to act when they can, and I think another important thing for people to do, and Kathy, again, you sort of spoke to this and speaking to this audience and saying, put pressure on your president to do something. One of the things that I think the publics have an obligation to do is to pressure our institutions and our governments to respond differently, and to understand things differently. And I mean, it's asking a lot. I mean, what you just said, Shana, about this is a Turkish government policy that you're describing. It's asking a lot of Turks to pressure their government to do something differently vis-a-vis Syrians. But I think that is also an ethical imperative. And the same way that we here have an ethical imperative to speak up and to our governments and the institutions of which we are a part.
And that resonates well with some of the points that Ilana was making as well, in terms of thinking about questions of governance in the region. Anyone here? I just want to make sure I'm attentive. I can't see all the hands and faces. Okay. Anyone online? Or I want to make sure also our panelists, I'm sorry, I haven't had a chance to monitor if hands went up or if any of you wanted to comment or respond to any of the issues or questions that have been raised so far.
I just wanted to add to what Ilana just said. I implore the US audience to look at the front pages of our newspapers and see if they're even discussing this earthquake. I have been really disheartened to see the kind of insignificant amount of media coverage. 40,000 people have died. When the war in Ukraine broke out, there was nonstop coverage of the humanitarian suffering. We do not see those images on our televisions or in our newspapers. And I think this is a result of the fact that we've already decided that we are not going to engage politically. So sort of the last part of my presentation was that to effectively respond to this crisis requires a political solution. And everything I've seen from the EU, US, and UN indicates we do not have the appetite to do that. The US is sending lots of search and rescue teams into Turkey. You're seeing very little commitment to Syria. France, same. Germany is providing a lot of assistance, but again, they have a very large Turkish diaspora, so that makes a lot of sense. But again, a lot of that aid is going into Turkey. It's not a politically easy response, but it's politically easier than the Syrian side. So I think we need to ask these questions, right? Like, do you notice a difference in the way that these humanitarian crises are covered? Why, right? Why is there not as much compassion when someone looks like me than if they look like someone else, right? And I don't think we ask those questions, but I've been really amazed at the sort of lack of public attention. you know, even at a like a bake sale level, right? There were little kids doing bake sales for raising money for Ukraine. I haven't seen any of that in the United States. And that really makes me sad, actually. Sorry to end on a really sad note.
So we've gone over time. I don't want to impinge on people's time, but we can also do the slow wind down. If folks have any lingering questions or comments or thoughts. If not, on that note, a grim note, a sobering note, but an important note, right? One of the animating reasons why we've held this teach-in is recognizing that there's cycles of spectacle and then apathy. And as you rightly pointed out, Miriam, and this echoes with comments that were made by a number of panelists, also Ilana underscoring the issue of, you know, who's legible and on what terms in terms of aid and assistance. There is gross disparities in terms of populations and regions and the types of attentions that they get. So in addition to cycles of spectacle and apathy, we also have to think about how that is differential and racialized and politicized. And so something for us all to grapple with. No easy answers, but something for us to grapple with importantly. So thank you all for your participation today. I hope this is the beginning of ongoing conversations and activity and scholarship and intellectual work. And thank you all for coming again today.